Welcome. This is David Boles, Human Meme. Today's topic: get to the point. You know the type of person who never listens, or the type of person who is unable to take the common ideas we share here in our favorite Human Meme podcast. Well, that type of personality is brash and laden, long-winded, and never really gets to the point. And that's a problem. Today, too many of us prefer to talk instead of listen to each other. Part of that is because it is harder to listen, and it is easy to talk. And if you just talk, making speeches, then you never really have to stop and try to understand what the other person is saying in response to you. Those big talkers just keep their heads down and blabber onward. You know the type. Now, sometimes people take over a conversation because they don't speak the common language well enough to comprehend what others are saying. And so, for them to cope, for them to deal with their deficiencies, they have long mastered the art of speaking, but not of interpreting. Not enough to listen, not enough to comprehend. When you have that sort of person talking, you won't get them to listen to you. You'll struggle to be heard. You're just a participant in a conversation. Accept your dominant fate and get out as soon as you are able. The art of brevity is something to celebrate, earn, and practice. Many people can speak and speak ever long, but few of us can get the point across speaking precisely with perception and with clarity. We tend to get by with just enough words to meet the day and not ruin the night. Learning to be brief as a speaker can be a harrowing experience. Living in New York City tends to help. You speak fast just to keep up. You act fast and you move fast here. And yes, sometimes I have been known to say to people who are not from the tri-state area of New York, New Jersey, and Connecticut, I say to them, speed up. And sometimes, speak faster. And yes, that's all a little bit rude and a lot brusque. But that's the reputation of New York City communications. And here's how I got here from there. A long time ago, I was visiting New York City in the late 1980s to decide finally if I wanted to attend the Columbia School of the Arts graduate program in playwriting. The chair of the department was Dr. Howard Stein. And I took the fast train, the Amtrak train, up from Washington, D.C. to New York. Oh, and hey, side note, did you know Washington, D.C. is actually a southern city? Yes, Washington, D.C. is actually below the Mason-Dixon line. So keep that in mind when you think of the influence of politics and problems when it comes to existing in our national capital. Washington, D.C. is, in its heart, a southern city with southern values and memes and methods of interaction and inspection. And despite what some say, Washington, D.C. is not really a part of the liberal Eastern Corridor. Okay then, so way back then, I took the fast train up from Washington, D.C., where I'd been living for a few months after finally escaping, really, Lincoln, Nebraska. And Washington, D.C. was a good transition city for me from the Midwest, from Lincoln, Nebraska, to a much bigger town. Plus, we were lucky enough to land a prime apartment share. A house share, really. On Capitol Hill, near Eastern Market. Right on Independence Street. We lived 2 houses away from, at the time, Speaker of the House, Tip O'Neill. So, arriving in New York City, I enter the Columbia campus and Dodge Hall, where the School of the Arts is founded. I was fresh-faced and nervous to meet my great friend and, I thought, mentor, Dr. Howard Stein. And I'm waiting in the office for Howard, and he's late, and he finally rolls in angry and upset about something. And Howard lived passionately, and he was usually always yelling about something. And after you got to know Howard, you quickly learned to let him blow up. Blow up in anger at you, against you, with you, around you, and then it was over. So Howard comes into his office, coiled and ready to strike. But I didn't know that at that time. And his secretary announced that I had been waiting for him, and she pointed at me with a nod of her head. And Howard didn't seem to either know or remember we had a meeting set up. And he was a little brusque with me, and I stammered to introduce myself. And he put up both hands as if to stop me from speaking and moving. And he yelled, screamed at me, "Get to the point!" Oh, ouch. Oh, that still hurts today, 30 years later. Get to the point! And Howard Stein was staring at me and snarling and raging at me and full of hatred. And I was not accustomed to that. I was raised in the fragile Midwest, where you were always friendly and polite, even if you didn't feel you needed to be. And in the Midwest, you just don't yell at strangers. You ignore them. And you certainly don't yell to people you just met, who traveled far and away to meet you. So my expectation of warmth and chemistry and companionship from Howard Stein disappeared in that moment of yelling. And we'd been in touch via phone and letter for at least 2 years before that day. Howard Stein screamed at me again. Get to the point! I wanted to run, but I didn't. I wanted to yell back, but I didn't. I managed to stammer my name. Hello, I'm David Boles from Nebraska. We had a meeting. And then Howard Stein warmed right up. He shook my hand and put his arm around me like we were old friends and walked me back into his office, pulled out the chair, had me sit down. The yelling was over, and Howard was charming. And sitting there in his office, I felt as if I had passed a test. I was able to get to the point, and I lived to tell about it. And now, I admit fully, I am a get-to-the-point type of person. Perhaps I've always been a get-to-the-point type of person, but didn't really accept it or confess it, until Howard Stein screamed it into me. Now, you may have watched my brief 10-minute film called Watershed that I wrote, produced, and directed while I was an undergraduate at the University of Nebraska-Lincoln. And that was many years before I met Howard. And you can find a link to that movie today, hosted by Vimeo, if you travel on over to bolesblogs.com or scriptprofessor.com and look for the movie link in the sidebar or the page. And I guess I knew really back then way back then that if I wanted to make a quick and final movie in Nebraska as a finishing statement for my time in the Flatlands, it needed to be brief and to the point. I knew I wanted to shoot on film. I knew I didn't have any money to make a long-form movie on film. I wanted to draw my foul lines and then control them and abide by them. Short movie, 10 minutes or so, get in and out, show what I could do, tell a story, write a right script, be done. And one thing I knew was that powerful people in New York City and Los Angeles and Chicago don't have a lot of time to mess around with young talent or old fools. Get to the point. And so I knew my chances of getting heard, of being seen, were better with a 10-minute movie than a 2-hour show. Well, sure enough, some people who watched the movie wanted more. They wanted a longer story. But to them, that just meant more time, not necessarily a better movie. No, as then as now, the length of the movie Watershed is just right at about 10 minutes. And even during the filming of Watershed all those years ago, some of the actors, in the middle of shooting scenes, thought we should expand the movie to make it longer. No, I would say, that isn't the intention. In fact, we made a conscious decision not to want live, wild sound. That complicates things, adds time and tide, and costs a lot more money in your post-production budget. So we used original music and voiceover to tell our tale of Watershed, and that context in those foul lines. We found success. And now, over 30 years later, I am confident, just as much now as an old fool, as I was back then as a young talent, that we did the right thing by writing and sticking to and producing a 10-minute movie. And that Watershed story still holds up today. Go watch, you'll see. You'll want more. And always leave them wanting more. Because if they are asking for less, you have failed them. And that philosophy applies to every single thing in your life. Less is more. More is less. More or less. Get to the point. And please remember, my human meme friend, when it comes to brevity versus the length of moments, hearken back to the fantastic question that reveals more about the person who answers the question than it does about the person asking the question. And that universal question of truth in a moment is this: how long is a piece of string? Yes, ask that, and you'll get a bunch of answers about varying degrees and inches and meters and ancient lengths compared to today's understanding of length. But there is only one real answer to that question. How long is a piece of string? And that answer is this: as long as it needs to be. We are built for getting to the point. SMS, text messages, voicemail. And hey, speaking of voicemail, is your message to callers long, too short? There's a fine line between being polite and being curt. Know the difference? And we do tend to prefer email to phone calls because we can work in asynchronous time and not real time. Measure twice, cut once, speak once, listen a lifetime. Thank you for listening. Be a human meme.